Well, good morning, everyone, and I certainly appreciate your attending and appreciate your punctuality as well, and thank all of you for being here. I think most of you know we're here this morning in the Whitten building of the USDA by virtue of an executive order that our president signed back a few weeks ago. And I like to say, if you know anything about our president, it was not an executive suggestion, it was an executive order. And that's exactly why we're here, dealing with rural prosperity, which really affects all of our agencies to some degree. The great thing about this executive order, it's an interagency task force, and that's why Team USA is here today. I want to thank certainly our principals for being here and all the agencies being represented, and we're going to give them an opportunity to speak here in just a moment. But we know that there may have been a little anxiety from rural America over the timing of the nomination of the Secretary of Agriculture, but I can assure you the President has moved swiftly after that to make sure that he lets everyone know that agriculture is important and rural prosperity is important. We know that our U.S. economy depends on that. Ambassador Lighthizer is third day in a row here, so we also understand from an economic development standpoint, Ambassador, what trade issues are there out there, and we look forward to doing them. This task force, this interagency task force, has until October the 22nd to develop a plan for rural prosperity, and it will be an operational plan. Our goal is not to provide a report, but an operational plan to execute. And again, we have a lot of meetings here and a lot of talking going on, but this is going to be an effort to really develop a serious plan. We're not kidding ourselves. People in rural America know that the United States government, even as powerful as it is, can't make it rain and can't make the sun shine. But they do know that we can help to create a fertile bed for their prosperity by making sure that we look at our regulations, whether they're helpful or hurtful. No way are we looking to wipe the slate clean regarding environmental regulations or food safety regulations. We're only looking to enhance the betterment of America through safe food, good environment. We know that most of our people in rural America are great stewards of the land. We want to give them an opportunity to operate that way and to and make their case for how they can help America prosper once again. So I want to thank each and every one of you here this morning for being here. And at this time, Director Mick Mulvaney of the Office of Management and Budget is a person whose agency really covers virtually all of our agencies. All of our paths go finally through Office of Management and Budget. And I'd like for him to address the purposes here. He knows he hears from the President virtually on a daily basis about policy and the things that the President would like to see happen. He can tell you how serious the President is about a prospering rural America. And I'd like to call upon Administrator Director Mick Mulvaney.
Thanks, Sonny, and thanks for doing this, because you're absolutely right. The President, I think, by virtue of the fact he's asked us to come together as a team, and that Secretary Perdue is bringing us together as from various parts of the government, indicates the President understands that rural America is just different. And if you're not from there, like I am, go. I was talking to Mr. Pai, he just spent 5 days on the road. Rural America is different, and it's not just a different challenges they face regarding agriculture. It's everything. Housing is different in rural America. Energy is different. Communications is different. And if you're going to address the needs of rural America, you can't do it one agency at a time. You have to do it like we're doing it here as a team effort. And I think the President recognizes that and has already asked me to sort of make sure that we do this as a team, because that's the only way you're actually going to accomplish anything. I do encourage us to look at the various federal programs that exist in each of the agencies that are represented here. At the same time, I also encourage us to look more broadly at the policies. Programs are great and they can work, but by their very nature are often targeted. If programs alone were going to help solve the challenges that rural America faces, we would have fixed them a long time ago. But when we start talking about the broader policies of the administration, that's where I think we can start painting with a very broad brush and really changing the environment that the rural America faces. And you can, again, go down the list from energy to housing to communications to trade, that it's the policies that we need to be focusing on. I'm glad to get a chance to do it as a group. So I thank the Secretary for inviting me and involving OMB, and I look forward to doing whatever we can to help the team effort.
Thank you very much. I think, again, Director Mulvaney talked about some things, and the data suggests that while economic recovery is occurring across the United States, it's not occurring equally. Recovery is not occurring equally across the United States. Our unemployment is still below where it was in 2008 in rural areas, and 85% of our impoverished counties are in rural areas. Oftentimes we talk about inner cities and the challenges there, and there are some in inner cities, but look at the data. 85% of our impoverished counties are still in rural areas. That means 1 in 4 rural children live in poverty. That's a rate not seen since 1986. And we all know, those of us involved in agriculture know the farm income having been down from a high in 2013, down 50%. There are very few businesses and industries that could survive with a 50% cut in revenue over in just 4 years. So those are the challenges we face. One of those areas obviously has to deal with the basics, and housing is one of those basics. And I'm very happy to have today Secretary Ben Carson here with us while he deals with an agency called Housing and Urban Development. He also has a great grasp to understand that housing in rural areas is just as important, and I look forward to working directly with Secretary Carson in our rural development program that Ann Hazlett, to my right, is heading up, to see how we can synergize our housing programs across the country, both urban and rural. So, Secretary Carson, thank you for coming this morning.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure working with Secretary Perdue, and glad to be here with some of the other secretaries and heads of departments. Looks like we've got all hands on deck for this incredibly important inaugural event. Now, in his inaugural address, our president vowed that the forgotten men and women of our nation would be forgotten no longer. And this is a mission that I and my colleagues at HUD carry on our heart every day, and one of the things that has brought us together in this room today. You know, the toughness and resolve of rural America is amazing. So many of the communities have borne the weight of lost work, a shrinking agricultural section, drug epidemics, and political apathy from Washington. But even the strongest towns and bravest people can suffer when the deck is stacked against them. Through suicide, depression, drugs, and alcohol, we've seen the rise of the so-called deaths of despair among those in the previously stable middle class. Men and women are in danger of losing not only employment, but their communal ties to friends and family. As a doctor myself, these preventable tragedies are deeply troubling and should move our nation to sorrow and, more importantly, to action. Some people, through no fault of their own, lose their homes. But it is also their children who might be losing a chance at home ownership in the first place. In the wake of the housing crisis of the last decades, millennials are in danger of becoming the lost generation of homeowners. That's why I'm glad that HUD programs like public housing, assisted multifamily programs, and housing choice vouchers serve rural communities as well as urban communities. Through Ginnie Mae, HUD also backs rural housing mortgages. Of the 1.3 million very low-income renters in non-metropolitan areas, HUD programs assist 300,000 households. But there's still a lot more we can do, especially in cooperation with other federal departments. Housing is my issue, but only one of the many issues that are on the table. We also are concerned about education, work, training, medical treatment. All of these things are vital. We also need to work through public-private partnerships across the nation. I've seen firsthand as I've traveled the success of our efforts when they are led and advised by local stakeholders. We cannot expect to just fix things remotely in conference rooms in Washington. Instead, we must give the ability back to local governments, charities, fraternities, faith-based organizations, and others to strengthen their neighbors as they know best. I look forward to combining our efforts to build a society where no family is forgotten, no generation is lost, a society with homes, jobs, education, and opportunity for all, and a society where people can disagree without becoming violent enemies, a society where every one of our fellow citizens may fully share in the American dream. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Carson. I think your compassion and your sincerity, I think, gives weight to that. Those are more than just words, and I know that's what we're here to really have action, and I commend you for believing that, not just saying those things, but I know that's your heart, and that's our goal of our president as well, to make those things happen. Other areas that we're going to talk about here today, obviously one of those is excessive and burdensome and unproductive regulation, as well as strengthening educational opportunities for those students in STEM in rural areas. We know that technology is taking a huge part in modern agriculture today, promoting small businesses out in rural areas as well, and increasing employment and agriculture-related jobs. The portfolio of agriculture, from jobs from production to logistics to packaging to shipping and many other areas to preparation is huge. And then we know we have a challenge with our family farms. Many young farmers who want to come back, men and women who'd like to go back to the land. There are high barriers of entry, and we need to assist them as well. And Secretary Lighthouse, or Ambassador Lighthouser, we've talked for the last couple of days about trade opportunities. One of the partners that Secretary Perry, I didn't realize we shared as many responsibilities in rural America as we do between the Department of Energy and the Department of Agriculture. And I think your experience, having been Secretary of Agriculture in Texas, you grew up there, you know it from the ground up. But we're interested to hear how the Secretary of Energy and the Energy Department, collaborating with USDA and all of our partners here today, can help rural prosperity.
Mr. Secretary, thank you. I was just thinking about the first time I stepped in this building in 1979. I think Bob Bergdahl was your predecessor, and as a young boy who was wanting to stay on the farm after spending some time in the Air Force and walking in this building and starting to get my education about how Washington worked. And I'm still in that, I'm in the PhD program now, but I'm still absorbing it. And by the way, bread pudding's a nice touch for a meeting this morning, so thank you, sir. Mick Mulvaney, I think, touched on maybe one of the more important parts of what we can take away from this today, and that is that regulations are probably one of the most, as you knew as a governor and as I learned as a governor, that one of the places that you can affect people either positively or negatively is on the regulatory side. And what Mick talked about agencies working together, I don't think there's been a more powerful statement made this morning. It reminded me a couple of ag terms, cross-pollination and hybrid vigor, and that working together, taking the best of each of these agencies and applying them making sure that we don't overregulate, that we do take into account the safety and the needs of our citizens, but we don't have regulations in place. And a great example of that on the rural side is over, investor-owned rural electric co-ops, investor-owned utilities, and seeking low-interest loans that can really make a difference in USDA's rural utility service. That's a great example of how we make sure that those are easily accessible. Increasing the use of energy efficient. A great example are these variable drive pumps in rural areas. I mean, there's some. The regulatory side of what you do in your agencies is really important. People. The president knew he was getting kind of he was getting more than just a Secretary of Energy with me. He was getting a governor that had the 14 years of experience of managing a fairly substantial entity. But he also knew that I was a guy from rural America. Paint Creek, Texas, 16 miles from closest place, got a post office. I grew up in a house that didn't have running water, still had a carbide plant outside of the old house. When REA came, it made a difference. When farm-to-market roads were built, they changed people's lives forever. And we can be the administration that can put processes into place, and mostly by getting out of their way. Most of the farm people say, man, if y'all just leave us alone, that'd be the best thing you can do. And leaving them alone translates into don't overregulate us. And I think if there's one thing, again, I'm going to go back to it, is yes, are we going to come up with new technologies that make living in a rural area better? You better believe it. It may be, it may be something on the communication side. It may be something. I give you a great example. Somebody said, "What in the hell is DOE doing over here at a rural agriculture, and how do you make rural America more prosperous?" In the Idaho National Labs, Mr. Secretary, we have a focus on how do you use agricultural products to create a more efficient, or I should say more efficient use of these agricultural products in energy sources. So, there's some real cross-pollination, again, between these agencies that I think Mick talked about, again, that's very, very important. Our national labs are going to continue to play a very important role coming up with new technologies that can, in fact, in a very positive way, impact their lives. When I left Austin, Texas, I'd spent 25 years in that town. And my wife and I decided we want to move back to rural Texas. And we did. We're 75 miles from Austin. We're 3 miles from Round Top, Texas, population 90. I hope when we leave here today that the President of the United States knows that he has surrounded himself with men and women who are true advocates for a part of America that has as much potential, that from time to time gets forgotten, that is the foundation of this country. And decisions that we make in this city have for a long, long time affected their lives. I hope when we are finished with our time here that they will look back, Dr. Carson, and say, well done, good and noble servant. Thank you.
Secretary Perry, you are likewise a very passionate spokesperson and advocate for American rural agriculture and rural prosperity, and I know that's by your own testimony. That's because you have lived it and you are living it, and we thank you for being here. My first 100 days in this town were spent in the halls of 3 Senate buildings trying to get confirmed. I visited with 75 of our senators there, and I heard 3 things repeated over and over. irrespective of whether they were from rural areas or from urban areas or whatever district they work. What I found was that virtually every one of our senators and most all of our Congress members have agriculture in their district, and they're concerned about it. And the three things that I heard over and over again was trade, regulation, as Secretary Perry said, and again how we can do better in all those aspects of doing well by doing good. I've asked the relationship that we've tried to develop personally, knowing that American agriculture functions is going to be dependent upon good trade policies. We know the productive capacity of American agriculture. That's been demonstrated so well. And we've got challenges because of their productivity in making sure that a hungry world out there benefits by the things that we can grow, do very, very well. Food, fiber, fuel, and coming soon, even pharmaceuticals. And that's why I've tried to develop a personal relationship with our U.S. Trade Representative, Bob Lighthizer, and he knows this job. He knows this relationship, and the relationship between him and Secretary Wilbur Ross and I are like-minded and understanding that food is a noble thing to trade, and we do it very, very well. So you've joined me the last couple of days, Ambassador Lighthizer, and I want to thank you for coming once again today to demonstrate your awareness as a trade representative of the United States, how important your area is in rural prosperity.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. I basically get up, come to the office, and ask my staff, what does the Secretary of Agriculture want me to do today? And then if I have any time left over in the course of the day, I take care of some of the other matters. But when I went through my process, the senators made it pretty clear that agriculture and agriculture trade was very important too. And our starting point is that we have the most competitive agriculture industry in the world, and anybody that has a trade surplus with us ought to be buying more agricultural products. So my contribution to this Interagency Task Force is two things. One, income through trade, and two, the contribution we can make to innovation, which is so important to the business of agriculture. Approximately 20% of farm income comes from exports. That's huge. And for every dollar of exports, there's an additional $1.25 in economic activity in the rural community. And another point, Mr. Secretary, that we ought to talk about when we're in the administration trying to decide on trade priorities is that the food, beverage, and tobacco manufacturing industries in aggregate are the largest manufacturing industries in the United States in terms of output and jobs. And I think that's very important when we sit and we talk about manufacturing and agriculture. The truth is that agriculture is manufacturing. But as you know, as much as we've focused on it and as much as we've done, we can clearly do better. We are going to do better in our negotiations. We're going to do better in negotiating better deals for agriculture, and we're going to do better in terms of enforcement of our current deals. And I think the proof will be maybe in the bread pudding as we move forward. Our producers face a multitude of barriers in getting their products into foreign markets, particularly in the cases where U.S. producers use advanced, innovative technology, such as biotechnology, to improve productivity and cost. And what we see is barriers to trade in this area. And they're largely barriers to trade not based on science. So one of our highest priorities in the trade area obviously is opening markets. And the way we do that in part is to tear down these barriers to trade that are not science-based. It's one of the most important things that we're working on in the trade area. And the truth is, if we can't get our innovative products or our products made through innovative technology overseas, there's a reluctance to incorporate that technology into our own production here at home. So it has a double effect. And it's something that USTR is very concerned about. We're focusing on. We're going to bring cases at the WTO and in other venues, and we're going to insist that any barriers be science-based and the United States increase exports. So I'm very happy to be part of this interagency task force. I kid the secretary, but the fact is he is doing a spectacular job for agriculture, and I know that the president is very, very focused on agriculture and rural communities, and for a lot of reasons, but one big reason is the sector of agriculture. So thank you. We're pleased to be here and hope we can make a real contribution.
Thank you, Bob. Secretary Perry asked, what does DOE and the USDA have to do together? You're going to wonder this next guy, probably even more so. We've got the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission here, Ajit Pai, this morning, and you say, well, FCC, USDA, help me here. He's going to help explain there because, as you may know today, we've talked about housing, we've talked about energy, we'll talk about water, but there's another almost necessary item here in rural America today, and that's connectivity. And our farmers are using connectivity and rural broadband for precision agriculture, as well as the sociological aspects of just remaining connected with the rest of the world here. So, Chairman Pai, I want to thank you for already reaching out in this area, understanding and grasping ahead of time the connectivity aspect. When we think about infrastructure, rural broadband is one of those first things that come to mind, along with all those other kind of things like sewer and water treatment plants and roads and bridges. We look forward to you working with us in this Interagency Task Force on how we literally connect America. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary, for the invitation. Thank you for convening all of us here. Thanks to my counterparts at all of these agencies for showing both in number and in spirit how important this issue is. And thanks, of course, to the President for kicking off this conversation with an executive order that I think was highly overdue. This is an issue that is not just a professional obligation for me, it's a personal passion. I grew up in a small town on a gravel road outside of Parsons, Kansas, about 3 hours south of Kansas City, and I got to see for myself how important it is to help these people make ends meet. In my current position, I've had the privilege of visiting a lot of parts of rural America. As Director Mulvaney said just last week, I was in some towns that millions of Americans have forgotten about if they ever knew. Madelia, Minnesota, Durand, Wisconsin, Lorenz, Iowa, Wall, South Dakota. These are places that are off the beaten path, but they are critical to the fabric of American life, not least because of agriculture. And while some of the questions they would ask me were varied, it could be about broadcast radio or broadband connections, the gist of the questions was the same. Does the federal government care about us? And I think with your leadership, Mr. Secretary, with the President kicking off this interagency working group, we are providing an answer, which is a resounding yes. And I was very grateful to you for inviting us because I think the Federal Communications Commission does have a part to play in helping rural America. One of the things that we do, of course, is making sure that every American who wants high-speed communication services is able to get them. In fact, that's the very reason why the FCC was created back in 1934. And there are a lot of things that we can do to improve connectivity, which we'll talk about in a bit. But I just wanted to mention why connectivity is important, especially when it comes to agriculture. Some people still think that we are operating in the age of the analog tractor, but that's no longer the case, as you and many others know all too well. You know, I visited a meat processing plant in Diller, Nebraska, where I got to see how the owner is able to monitor remotely all of his sites with Wi-Fi connectivity. And he told me how he's able to make sure that his employees are able to work on more productive things other than paperwork by submitting forms to the USDA electronically instead of having to fill them out by pencil, which is what they had to do 20 years ago. He's now able to use the internet to ship his product to all 50 states and around the world. I mean, this is literally a business that could not have existed in the way it does now 25 years ago before the internet existed. I've also been to places like Allen, Kansas, population 75, where I got to hear how the owner of a feedlot is able to monitor in real time the intake of each and every one of his cattle to make sure that they're getting the feed they need, the antibiotics they need, so that he can represent to his buyers, I can guarantee you that this particular cow is top notch. That's a differentiating factor that he couldn't have had if he was operating in the analog age. Similarly, I've been to Whitehall, Maryland, where I got a chance to ride on a GPS-controlled combine. It's probably good that the combine wasn't being operated by me, but I got to see without a single person, they were able to really specifically direct how this combine operated. And they could even monitor using an iPad app exactly which parts of the field needed more water or less, more pesticide or less. I mean, these are stories that are just incredibly important, I think, for agriculture. And of course, when it comes to rural America, I mean, agriculture is not the only application for technology like the internet. When it comes to healthcare, some of these folks I've met live 100 miles away from a specialist. The internet might be their only chance to get medical expertise that is comparable to what we get in some of the bigger cities. Education. I've been to an Alaska Native village where I got to see how some kids in an Alaska Native school are able to use the internet to get information that all of us can view very easily. Same thing with job creation. Obviously, it's important if you're an entrepreneur in a rural area to be able to reach a massive customer base. The internet lets you do that. But most importantly, agriculture, rural healthcare, education, and the rest, all of it comes down to, I think, a sense of hope. That in a lot of towns in this country, including in my own hometown, some folks are skeptical about the future. They don't think that rural America is a place to raise a family, to get a job, to build a brighter future for yourself. And so they end up moving to places where they might not rather move. They'd rather stay in their hometowns. And I think technology is one way of addressing that issue. And so I'm hopeful that with this working group, with some of the work product that we are able to generate, we're going to try to reverse that brain drain, so to speak, and give people a brighter sense about the future. So thank you once again, Mr. Secretary, for your leadership, and thanks again to all of the folks around this table. This is an important issue, and I'm just grateful to be a very small cog in a very big wheel.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. You've so articulately expressed, I think, not only the need, but the passion and the understanding of what your agency can do in the contribution of the prosperity and the hope of rural America. So you've done a wonderful job. Your examples there were just fantastic. It reminded me of a visit to the panhandle of Idaho just a couple of weeks ago. Sawmilling there, obviously in our U.S. forests, is a big deal. This was not our father's or our grandfather's sawmill. I went in where they were literally using an MRI machine to look at the inside of the log to tell their computer saw how to saw that log for the best optimization of output there, raising their productivity 8 to 10% over those kind of things. You can't do that without being connected, and it's so important. It's really becoming the roads, the water, the sewer of the 21st century is connectivity. So thank you very much for not only your understanding, but your passion about resolving those issues. And we've, Secretary Perry mentioned, we've had great examples in the past, our Rural Electrification Association there and others that he and I are old enough to have some personal history with. But I'd love to be the forerunner of connecting America in those same similar ways through our cooperatives, our independent associations, and phone companies and others that can make a huge difference. So thank you very much. I didn't get to the third thing the other day. Earlier when I said trade, regulation. The third thing is what the next person I want to call on today had to do with labor. A reliable farm supply of agricultural workers is very, very important. Secretary Acosta of Labor and I have had a chance to visit with this. He's obviously not able to make it here with all the hearings on the Hill today, but he has sent a representative from his department, and I want to call on his Chief of Staff, Wayne Palmer, to talk about rural agriculture and its relationship and its need for a reliable supply of agricultural workers. Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Yes, I'm Wayne Palmer, Chief of Staff to Labor Secretary Alex Acosta, and I grew up in Forks Township, Pennsylvania, and my wife is from the heart of Amish country in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I'm never happier than when we go back and visit her family. And on Sunday mornings, I wake up and I hear the clip-clop of those Amish horses and buggies going to church every Sunday morning. Earlier this month, our Bureau of Labor Statistics reported some very good news. Unemployment is at a 16-year low. But there are 6 million vacant jobs across this country. That's the highest level since 1980. Yet, 95% of Business Roundtable CEOs report that finding talent to match the jobs they have is a big challenge, and that's especially true of manufacturing, IT, and healthcare. Clearly, there's a skills gap, and that's true of both urban and rural areas. We're in the middle of a big apprenticeship rollout throughout the month of June, driven by the White House, especially the President and Ivanka Trump, and of course supported by Secretary Acosta. But apprenticeships are just one of the models. Just yesterday, for example, Secretary Acosta met with a young industrial engineer from Southwire. In your home state, Mr. Secretary, I know you toured their campus and are familiar with their 12 to Life program that operates in a rural area outside of the Atlanta MSA. Southwire bridges the divide between traditional apprenticeships and four-year college, where this young woman, when she was in high school, was exposed through Southwire's program to STEM and eventually graduated from Auburn into a career track she otherwise told me she never would have considered, and now she is employed as an engineer at Southwire. So there are different innovative models that we're looking at, and Department of Labor looks forward to participating in this task force so that rural workers have the skills needed by employers in their region. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
I'm delighted that you and the Department of Labor and Secretary of Acosta become acquainted with Southwire. They're one of our great corporate citizens in Georgia and have had a definite role in the lives of young people, enabling them to accomplish more than they ever thought that they could. Mm-hmm. Next, there are some more similar areas of likelihood relationships there that we've had. One of those is the relationship that we've been able to build with the Secretary of Interior. We share a lot of responsibilities, but Secretary Zinke and I have been in Montana and Idaho together. We toured that sawmill and saw others, our National Fire Center there, where we share. The Bureau of Land Management and U.S. Forest Service, as well as our parks, often have a lot of collaboration, a lot of impact. When you look at the percentage of public lands in some of these states, at almost 2/3, whether it's Bureau of Land Management or the U.S. Forest Service. So I appreciate Secretary Zinke sending his acting deputy here, Jim Cason, this morning. Thank you, Jim, for coming, and why don't you report from our Secretary of Interior?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Secretary Zinke sends his regrets that he couldn't be here. He's actually on another mission for the President in the area of Massachusetts and Maine, looking at Katahdin Woods and the National Monument there. In the area that we're talking about today, I too come from rural America. I grew up as an itinerant farm laborer's kid, moved all over the western half of the U.S., and the biggest towns we lived in were the ones with one gas station and one stoplight. So it was quite an awakening to come here to Washington, D.C. for the first time in 1982. Within the focus that we're talking about today, there's a number of things within the Department of Interior that I think lends itself to these issues. One is development of rural water. It's like the life, beginning point of life cycle of agriculture in the West. I just met yesterday with the National Congress of American Indians, and that's a population that's desperate for economic development. And so I think we'll find a lot of nexus there. And our programs, along with the Department of Agriculture, we're basically rural-based everywhere. And so the development of our natural resources is high on our agenda. And Mr. Secretary, one of the things that we would look forward to is taking a look at our respective timber programs and seeing what we can do on that. Because we're increasingly going in a direction of raising firewood for tomorrow's future serious fire as opposed to utilizing timber as a natural resource. And we think that there's a lot of ways that we can go about changing that and entering timber into the national commerce. So with that, we're very willing to help on all of the panels that you're looking at because I think all of them have an effect on Interior's interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Another agency that U.S. Department of Agriculture and Rural Prosperity depends on to a large degree is Environmental Protection Agency. This is another individual that the President has chosen who has the courage and the wisdom to look at things from a different perspective and make decisions that are fundamentally helpful in many areas of that way. And we've got a representative here from the Environmental Protection Agency, Director Pruitt. Again, I think he'd rather be here this morning than maybe where he is, but let me call on our representative from the Environmental Protection Agency.
Thank you, Secretary, and I think you might be right. For those who might not be privy, the Administrator is testifying before the House Interior Appropriations Committee this morning, so he also sends his regrets. One of the first locations that he visited prior to being confirmed as EPA Administrator was Thomas Hill Electric Cooperative. I know there have been a lot of mentions of the REA this morning, and he there heard from not just local workers at the facility, but also local Farm Bureau members came because they were so excited to have an EPA administrator that they think they'll be able to work with. And they didn't have anything to do with the plant other than they just wanted to come see the administrator because they are excited because all of them understand the importance of affordable, reliable electricity, and that's what propels rural America. And without it, it really hampers innovation and development in rural America. And overregulation, as we all know, can contribute to higher electricity prices, which isn't conducive to any of the aforementioned activities. Another area that won't come as a surprise is we are looking at the waters of the U.S. Regulation. We will be withdrawing it first. It's going to be a two-step process, but then there needs to be some clarity going forward in what that looks like. And so Administrator Pruitt is committed to going directly to those impacted by it to see what might look workable in their state. He wants to hear from the people who are directly impacted by WOTUS, and that's rural America. And then finally, you think of EPA, you think of overregulation, unfortunately, but there are some positive, proactive programs that we partake in that I think are go a little bit unheard of. And one of those is our Brownfields Grants Program. So it's basically a reuse, cleanup and reuse of previously contaminated sites and redevelopment. And there's an estimated 450,000 abandoned and contaminated sites in the U.S. And these grants make a visible difference in rural communities across the country. And actually, as of May 2017, more than 124,000 jobs, 24.3 billion of public and private funding has both been leveraged. An example is in the town of Hickory, North Carolina. They used one of these grants to leverage Rural Infrastructure Authority state grants to convert an abandoned textile mill into a hub for shopping centers, restaurants, stores, and as you can imagine, Hickory is not a big town, and so that created a lot of viable jobs that they still continue to, permanent jobs that they retain today. So that's something on Administrator Pruitt's proactive agenda to make sure that we get out and clean up those sites as well.
That's a great idea and a great vision for America. We've got a good example right in almost downtown Atlanta with Atlantic Station there. That was a major eyesore coming through our interstate system through downtown Atlanta. Atlantic Steel, former steel company there, has been recovered and restored, and now is a vital multi-family, multi-use type of thing. And I know we've got a lot of other opportunities across the country where that could be done as well. So I appreciate the Administrator's vision and the President's vision about how we can reclaim and restore and create vital economic activity in those areas as well. Another agency that we also understand in rural America has a lot to do with how we do, from our farming practices to other areas of water impoundments and wetlands and so forth that rural America deals with, is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And I want to thank Major General Jackson for being with us this morning to talk about the U.S. Corps of Engineers' role in rural prosperity as well.
Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for the opportunity to join you here today, and we're looking forward to participating in many of the working groups. I believe that the Army Corps of Engineers has a lot to add to this vision that you've stated and is being led by the President. Whether it's a navigation mission that we have, or we have 13,000 miles of coastal inland waterways, or the 12,000 that we have that run throughout rural America, I think that's a key transportation hub for agriculture and certainly a key point for prosperity for rural America, as we touch so many small towns up and down the waterways. But we're continuing to work with your staff and within the administration to try and improve our ability to deliver efficiently, consistently, and reliably the transportation that's required for this nation's economy. Flood risk management, we work very closely with a number of agencies to manage floodwaters, whether it's the operation of our dams and levee projects that we have up and down the river systems, or whether it's what we do with the Department of Energy on our hydropower program, where we work very closely with power marketing agencies to electrify rural America through their electric cooperatives that they do business with. We also have large recreation sites and are very involved in the management of environmental resources across the nation. And we do that in partnership with the states and many other folks in government. But certainly all of these things that we're talking about now touch rural America, touch agriculture in many, many ways. Like the EPA, we're also very involved in the regulatory program. And again, we're committed to working within the administration to look at ways that we can streamline permitting. I know that's a big issue that we've talked about quite a bit, and I know that's something that the President is working very hard to address, and we certainly want to be a part of the solution for that. So again, we just thank you, sir, for the opportunity to be a part of the team and look forward to the work that's ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. That's encouraging news from the Corps. We all depend on your permitting and regulatory aspects in that, and we want to develop a good working relationship in that regard. I think it's interesting to note that the President insisted that his Council of Economic Advisors know and be aware of the contribution of rural America here today. And representing that council this morning is someone who's worked closely with Gary Cohn and also the President in helping to inform and to make all of our administration aware of the kind of issues that we're talking about here today. So I want to call upon now Ray Starling, who's the Assistant to the President for Agriculture, Trade, and Food Assistance. Ray, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure also to feel like I still represent not just Gary Cohn, but Autryville, North Carolina, which is where I grew up. And I would say it is a town that was so rural that we walked toward the big town when we got ready to hunt. So that's how rural it was. And I would add to that, we liked it that way. And there are a number of people there that still like it that way. And when I get back down there, I like it that way, and it's hard to get back on 95 and come north. So on behalf of Gary Cohn, on behalf of the National Economic Council, what Gary has asked those of us that work on the council to do, and my particular policy parallel is agriculture, agricultural trade, and food assistance. He asks us almost every week to identify and determine what are the barriers, what are the lids, what are the limits, or the governors, if you will, on economic growth in each of our sectors. And we answer that question in 4 ways, each of which have been touched on in the conversation already this morning: in access to trade in new markets, access to a reliable, legal, and qualified workforce, regulatory reform, and investments in infrastructure. This task force, in our view, gives us a platform to do that on a multi-agency level, with your leadership and the leadership of the other cabinet secretaries. And so I would close by saying we applaud that work. We're excited to be a part of it. And I would just put on the record, I think on our behalf, we understand that rural development is not the same thing as urbanization. I go back to my Autryville example that we liked it rural there, and we feel like we bring something to the fabric of the country that urban areas cannot bring. This should not be a task force focused on that effort. It should be focused on taking what we have in those rural areas and making it more prosperous. So we look forward to that work, Mr. Secretary, and appreciate your leadership in this effort.
Thank you, Ray. Another cog in this important effort is another council that we depend on, obviously, as an in-between, go-between various agencies that have to deal with policy and regulatory matters. That's our Council on Environmental Quality. As I stated earlier, our goal is not to eliminate regulations to the detriment of the environment or to safety, but to make sure that these regulations are accomplishing the purposes for which we've designed them. So I want to thank Mary Newmeyer for being here this morning and chairing the Council on Environmental Quality. Mary, good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. The Council on Environmental Quality, among other responsibilities, oversees the implementation of the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and so is very engaged on environmental reviews and working with agencies to address aspects of permitting and environmental reviews. And so we have been working with the National Economic Council and the Office of Management and Budget and other entities across the federal government on the President's infrastructure initiative, and we will be working to try to assist in facilitating a more timely and permitting process, review process, and in particular, we have had many members of the agricultural community come to us to talk about, among other things, water infrastructure and the importance of water infrastructure to the agricultural community. So we look forward to working with all the agencies on ways to streamline the review process. And in addition, we also look forward to working on regulatory reform issues and supporting the agencies as we look at some of the rules and regulations that have presented practical challenges to stakeholders in the rural communities as well as across the economy. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. Appreciate you being here as well. I mentioned earlier that this relationship between agriculture, USTR, and the Secretary of Commerce and Department of Commerce has been integral in making sure that we're able to move and sell our products worldwide. And I've been very pleased with the relationship that we've developed, the very close relationship we've developed with Secretary Wilbur Ross, who's also not here today, but commerce plays a huge part in many aspects of the portfolio, but we're particularly happy and pleased that Secretary Ross has engaged so voraciously in agricultural issues and negotiating a great sugar compact with Mexico, where they had been violating some rules there on sugar. He did a wonderful job there, and also as far as the Department of Commerce and its efforts and getting to beef into China, our team at Foreign Agricultural Services worked hands in glove with the Department of Commerce as well as the Trade Representative's office, and we're happy to have a representative here this morning, Brian Linehan from the Department of Commerce, to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you for having Commerce be here at this task force roundtable this morning. I have the unattainable task of filling the Secretary's shoes, and I know he sends his regrets as well, but you know you have to divide and conquer. He's across the street with your colleagues, former colleagues as well as governors, working on the Workforce for Tomorrow meeting, and Commerce stands at the ready to promote initiatives that will help get a successful result to the executive order the President's put forth. I kind of follow on your lead on trade, and I've been doing a lot of delegating. The last 60 days I've been in office here, and I get to do a little bit, not deferment, but I have the chairman and I have the ambassador here on the efforts that are going on at the Department of Commerce to promote trade. We have the International Trade Administration, and through the International Trade Administration we have the Foreign Commercial Service, which has a multitude of offices around the world that stand to provide technical service, advisory roles to get companies that are kind of out of the incubator phase at SBA and are at kind of a export-ready level to provide guidance on how to get their products to markets, including agricultural products and seed and fish and beef, to get those around the world in a streamlined manner through various parts of the government that have to do with transportation and getting through the ports and getting through customs. So along with that, I get to put in a little bit of a plug for Select USA. We have a summit next week at the Gaylord. Secretary Perry has been kind enough to keynote on one of those days, and we appreciate that. I think we have Pete Sessions, one of your colleagues, giving you the intro as well. And we have a record-breaking number of attendees that will be at that summit, over 3,000. 1,300, I believe, about are investors looking to put FDI, foreign direct investment, into the United States. So we're looking towards a successful outcome for that summit, that all the attendees, all the businesses will be able to have a little matchmaking with all the FDI that's across the borders to get those into the right places to promote economic productivity for all small businesses across the country. On broadband, I know we have the chairman here and he can talk ad nauseum, but we have Broadband USA, which is housed under the National Telecommunications Information Administration, and they also provide assistance in trying to figure out how to put the fiber in the ground. They're also looking forward to the next generation of 5G, also looking towards wireless and getting those components put into rural areas. And you had some great anecdotal stories there in trying to get fiber into communities where you can get online and get productive. So Broadband USA is and my enviable task is getting nominees through. So we're looking forward to getting the head of NTIA through the confirmation process. I know the team at NTIA looks forward to moving forward fast on Broadband USA initiatives. And on the STEM education front, I know we have one of our subject matter experts at NIST testifying today on the WannaCry ransomware event that happened. But at a more elementary level, at the education level, we have NIST provides the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education initiative, which works with higher education and private sector partners in developing new standards for security and best practices. So I know DHS has a similar initiative as well, and I'll stop there, and I appreciate the time.
Thank you very much. And I don't think you even mentioned NOAA, which we have an interaction capability with NOAA and our fisheries there as well.
I'll just say that I went to the fish fry last night. I didn't see a lot of you there, but I will promise to make sure you have invites because it's a great event. So.
Thank you very much. It's a great relationship there. And obviously, when you look at this Interagency Task Force, the breadth of it really surprises me, and the President's wisdom in understanding how many moving parts there are to here. We even have a representative from the Department of Justice here today to make sure that we're doing things legally, legitimately, and will pass the test of litigation there, because that's been a cottage industry in agriculture over the last few years, is the litigious society in which we operate. But we're happy to have our Department of Justice here this morning. Ms. Brand.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Well, we are delighted to be included in the task force as well. The Attorney General is in multiple in a small town in Iowa, so this is an issue that is personally important to me as well, and I really enjoyed spending time on my grandparents' farm outside Oskaloosa, Iowa, and my other grandparents' farm outside of Holland, Michigan, growing up. DOJ has a very deep reach throughout the country. We have 93 U.S. attorneys around the country, reach every part of America, and we believe that public safety really enables prosperity. And we touch that issue in a number of ways, of course, directly through law enforcement activities. It's very important to the Attorney General that we empower local law enforcement to do their jobs as well as possible. We do that through direct partnerships with federal law enforcement agencies and local law enforcement. We do that through grants, through the Office of Justice programs, through our Office of Violence Against Women, which actually has a specific rural initiative, and through our COPS office, which enables community-oriented policing around the country. Of course, the DEA is extremely focused on the opioid epidemic, which touches rural America all around the country, and on meth, which is, I think, a disproportionate impact on rural America. The AG is very focused on those issues, and we're actually deploying a large number of prosecutors from Main Justice out to the field to really focus on pharmaceutical diversion cases around the country. And then, of course, our regulatory reform initiative helps everyone all around the country. I think we share that initiative with every agency here. I serve as the chairman of the Regulatory Reform Task Force at DOJ, and I'm very focused on that as well. So again, thanks for having DOJ.
Well, thank you very much. Obviously, the quality of life issues, we've talked about housing, we've talked about water, we've talked about power, electricity, and others, but we all want healthy communities, and we can understand very easily how health and human services interact, and from a healthy perspective of a quality of life, but even more so, we share a lot of other responsibilities with the Food and Drug Administration under Health and Human Services. So we want to welcome Dr. Sigorgant this morning to talk to Sigornis, to be here with representing Health and Human Services.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Dr. Price could not be here today, so he sends his regrets. I spent my last 23 years as professor at East Carolina University, the Broad School of Medicine, which is located in eastern North Carolina, the Greenville of eastern North Carolina. Broad School of Medicine produces physicians who are focused in practicing primary care and rural medicine. I'm proud to say that 42% of our graduates are practicing primary care and 5% are practicing rural medicine, while the national average is about 0.5%. A crucial part of rural economic vitality is ensuring that rural residents have access to high-quality health care. HHS plays a significant role in that through its work with small rural hospitals, rural health clinics, and community health centers across rural America. Many HHS programs, from Medicare and Medicaid to the Community Health Center program, to the National Health Service Corps, as well as the support of public health through Centers for Disease Control, support rural health care delivery. HHS is already working with many of the other departments and partners represented on this task force, including USDA, the VA, and the Department of Labor. USDA has long been strategic HHS partner through its rural development programs that provide access to capital, through the food and nutrition programs, as well as its support for broadband, telemedicine, and distant learning. HHS looks forward to engaging with USDA, our White House partners, and other federal agencies to enhance the quality of life in rural America. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And I want to call on, we're almost out of time here, so we got a couple other people I'd like to speak, but Ray's compadre and the domestic policy also plays a huge role, and Director of the Deputy Assistant to President Paul Winfrey for domestic policy and budget policy. Paul, welcome, and obviously U.S. agriculture is domestic policy as well.
That's right. Thank you very much for having me, Mr. Secretary. I think like most people around this table, I have a personal connection as well to rural America. Originally from Southern Virginia, my wife's from dairy country in upstate New York, so we have both the northern and the southern connection of agriculture, and I have a unique perspective on both of those communities and the challenges to both those communities. Like my colleagues on the National Economic Council, the Domestic Policy Council gets up every morning and asks ourselves, how are we going to make America excellent that day? And a big part of that will ultimately be reflected by the different topics of this report that we've heard a lot of the agencies are already doing a lot of good work on. But in particular, one of the issues that we are particularly interested in is making sure that rural America and businesses in rural America have access to a reliable and a legal workforce so that they can ultimately do what they do best. And coming off of that, another big issue that is at the forefront of our domestic policy agenda that we've talked about already today through effectuation through the other agencies is in both deregulation and in creating better regulations so that American innovators and inventors can do what they do best and the federal government can get out of the way. And with that, like I said, I'm astounded to be here. Thank you very much for having us. Look forward to contributions and to the ultimate production of this report. And thanks for your commitment for this project, and looking forward to working with everybody around the table.
Thank you very much. While we've got a lot of interesting, innovative ideas over different infrastructure, we can't forget our roads and bridges. So we want to thank our Chief of Staff for the Department of Transportation, Jeff Burr, for being with us this morning. Those fundamental types of things we need for rural America.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be here today. Secretary Chow is disappointed she wasn't able to be here today, largely because she's instead at a House Appropriations Committee testifying right now. But at the Department of Transportation, we are very much focused and attuned to the needs of rural America. As the Secretary likes to remind people, as a proud Kentuckian, she hails from a predominantly rural state. One of the biggest things we're focused on, obviously, is the President's infrastructure package. And much of that is focused on a lot of the permitting and deregulation improvements that are possible, but also it's about leveraging the federal investment in all kinds of infrastructure. And some of that leveraging comes in things like public-private partnerships, that a new approach will be required in order to address the needs of rural America. A lot of what we've found is a lot of the programs, especially in the transportation space, when they innovate in ways that often begin in urban areas. And some of those innovations, like things such as tolling and using that to incent federal investment, aren't as viable in a rural area. And so I think many of the different agencies that are involved in producing the infrastructure package are focused on having a rural title and looking at those rural needs and making sure that innovations that might work in one area, we recognize they won't work in others. And so things like availability payments and other incentives that can be used to do a public-private partnership in a rural area and incent some private investment and some leverage there are something that we're very much focused on. The other thing we're looking at and spending a great deal of time on that I think involves rural America is technology and things like autonomous vehicles and drones and some of the things that Chairman Pai mentioned, some of the innovative ways that we can leverage that technology in rural America and in the area of agriculture. Those technologies are just at the beginning of where different levels of the government are looking to regulate them. And the question is, what's the right approach? What approach takes into consideration things like safety and privacy, but also doesn't stifle innovation and send it elsewhere? And so that, again, is something that we're very focused on and hopefully can be helpful in this effort. So again, excited to participate. Thank you for the invitation, and I look forward to working together on the issue.
Well, we have a robust rural development program in USDA. Many of our rural citizens also depend on the Office of Small Business, and happy to have Mr. Jones here this morning to just give us a brief comment from our Small Business Administration.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The Administrator regrets not being able to be here today, but she appreciates you having SBA be a part of this task force. You know the mission of the SBA is ultimately job creation across all our communities and across our rural communities. In the next few years, the Administrator will be on the Ignite Tour, visiting over 68 communities across the U.S., and many of those will be rural communities with a focus of listening to small businesses and entrepreneurs, understanding what are those obstacles that stand in their way from creating more jobs and growing their business, with a focus on regulatory reform, understanding what are the tax issues that are out there. In addition, on that tour, we will be educating the individuals on the different core programs that the SBA offers, from counseling, how can you work with some of our resource partners to understand accounting, finance, marketing. In addition to, if you're looking to raise capital, access to capital is so important to small businesses? How can you use our 7A program to secure working capital, or use our 504 program to be able to make large capital investments? In addition, it's making sure from this listening tour to be able to come back to Washington and really be an advocate for those rural small businesses. You know, ultimately, we want to be here to drive growth. So the administrator appreciates you allowing us to be a part of this task force, and we look forward to working with you.
Thank you very much. We have probably our largest agency in the federal government. The Department of Defense obviously has installations all over the United States, and many of those are in rural areas, and we appreciate the Department of Defense being represented as well.
Sir, I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here and represent Secretary Mattis, who is on the Hill today. Excuse me. You heard from our Civil Works side, General Jackson. From the purely defense side, many, if not most, of our installations are in rural areas. And the partnership that's developed over the decades of their presence there, I think, has been important, obviously, to us, as well as to the services that operate those installations. And I wanted you to hear from me, sir, that we want to enhance and continue that partnership as it will help this effort. And I can assure you that we're fully on board. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to follow the money to the Department of Treasury and with the money there. So let's hear from our representative from the Department of Treasury.
Good morning. My name is Kip Cranbuell, and I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary with the Office of Small Business, Community Development, and Housing Policy within the Treasury's Office of Domestic Finance. I'd like to thank the Department of Agriculture for hosting this meeting and leading this important task force. Treasury looks forward to working with all of you. We are committed to reviewing the ways that our programs can help increase economic opportunity and promote community development in rural areas. As you know, the administration is keenly focused on ensuring regulatory relief for community banks. Community banks disproportionately serve the needs of the nation's small businesses and rural communities, accounting for 43% of small loans to businesses and 90% of agricultural loans. Treasury strongly supports efforts to further enable our community banks and credit union sectors, and we look forward to continuing to work with each one of you.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank all of you for being here this morning. I think, again, I want to go back to the executive order. The order is to get something done. We're going to have working groups. We've got until October the 22nd to develop a product that guides us for the future. That's just the beginning here. We're going to have a quality of life working group. We're going to have a rural workforce working group, innovation, technology, and data working group, as well as an economic development working group. And we look forward for all of your agencies to be involved in that. I kind of want to tell you a little anecdote. When I was just first elected governor prior to inauguration, I had a big buff security guy that traveled with me, and I had a little small media guy that also traveled with me. This might be a lesson to some of you. And this little guy just kind of kept picking on him. He was sort of bullying the big guy. And just, I don't know if he was interested in suicide by cop or not, but anyway, he was just kind of picking on him. And finally, the security guy finally had enough and said, looked down at him and said, okay, little buddy, you got the talking part done. So we got the talking part done this morning. Now it's time for action. And we want to roll up our sleeves and go to work. But I want to thank Director Mulvaney for being with us the whole time. You might imagine he's got a lot to do, as well as Secretary Carson, Secretary Perry, and Ambassador Lighthizer. Thank all of you for being here this morning. And I look forward to what we can do by virtue of the President's Executive Order of Rural Prosperity and Interagency Task Force. And I want you all to have a cup of pudding on me, okay, a cobbler. So thank you all very much. We look forward to working with each of you.